Today we have some news. We also have the news of my proof of life. Here it is. I actually still exist. I am not just an AI voice being used to make videos. I am still existing in a physical form. What we're talking about today are the changes coming to the weekly reset for this, I guess, third week of the season. We have dungeon nerfs, we have raid nerfs, we also have trinket buffs, and then we also have a couple of quality of life changes, mostly around your money expenditure in this game. So let's start with we can call it the more relevant one, or rather the bigger one, which are the nerfs given to the raid bosses in this upcoming reset, being Broodtwister, Xy'veza nerfs, as well as Nexus Princess Xy'veza nerfs. Now, this is an interesting situation because we had this awkward situation when you looked at the rankings of the kills, where you found yourself having, at the moment, right this instant, you have about 837 mythic guilds killing Rashanan, right? And then if we go over to Broodtwister, you have about 60 guilds killing mythic Broodtwister. So you have about 820 guilds all stuck on Broodtwister. Only 60 of them actually managed to kill Broodtwister, and all the other 800 something are still stuck on the boss. That's a bottleneck if we have ever seen one. You know, you might have been used, if you're talking about Dragonflight, for example, going back to the progress, for example, in Vault, the biggest bottleneck about these bosses was perhaps Kurog. You know, the DPS check on Kurog, but he was already a pretty late boss. And then you move over to Aberrus. The original bottleneck in Aberrus used to be Rashok. The DPS check on Rashok as the 5th boss stopped a few guilds. Not for much though. And then in Amir Drasil, the only real bottleneck happened with Smolderon, right? And that was funny because players still had no idea what they would have had to go through with Tindral and then Ferak. But Smolderon was the first real big bottleneck. In this tier now, the real bottleneck first was definitely Xy'veza. You know, even if we go using well progress, which is slightly outdated with some off numbers, you can see the gap. You can see the bottleneck. You know, there is 2k guilds, and then 400 fewer guilds, and then 300 fewer guilds, and then 400 fewer guilds, and then 800. That's how big of a gap you have between the two bosses. So the nerfs in question are massive. They are massive because they get 15% of its HP nerfed. This is going to save you like what, 1-2 breaking of the eggs on the boss. You also have experimental dosage, which is the time you have practically to place your circles around the eggs to make sure you can break them properly. It's now 2 seconds longer. You also have the cast time of one of the more dangerous, or rather the dangerous cast of the worm ad, increased to 4 seconds, so you have even more time to stop it. More importantly, one of the bigger issues of guilds that would get run over by mobs was blood parasites infesting players, so they would spawn more ads. Now they're also crowd controllable when they are trying to cast infest, so it's gonna make it easier to prevent infestations from happening. And those are pretty much the most relevant nerfs. These are just fixes and minor changes, but these are the biggest ones and are definitely very sizable, which will allow the boss to now finally be progressed much more easily by the, you know, normal guilds compared to the top world guilds that got past Xy'veza already. However, it isn't just Xy'veza, because what would have followed after Xy'veza would have been an even bigger problem, because this is a big jump, yes, but in percentage, this is actually an even bigger jump, because 55 guilds killing Xy'veza, and of those 55 guilds, only 5 killed Nexus Princess. And then everyone who killed Nexus Princess also killed Silken Court. Usually, that's a sign that the boss prior to the one with the same kills is quite more easy, right? This is kind of, again, going back to Dragonflight, kind of what you saw when you had, for example, almost everyone who got kills on Ziskarn, for example, had almost instantly kills of Magmorax. That's because Magmorax was quite easier than the previous one. So once you got past the Skarn, you could kill Magmorax quite easily, quite quickly. So in Neruber Palace you have somewhat similar. If you manage to kill Xy'veza, you get to kill Silken Court way faster because Nexus Princess was a much bigger block. In this case though, it's almost the opposite of Broodtwister. Even if you have done these in Heroic, you will get the idea of the difference between the two bosses. Broodtwister is very mechanical, okay? It's very precise in the movements and in the managing of the adds, in the interrupts of the adds, in the spreading for the breaking of the eggs. Nexus Princess is the same fight, repeated for over 3 phases, you know, phase 1 intermission, phase 2 intermission, phase 3 last intermission, and it's repeated over and over and over. So technically, once you see the first phase and the first intermission, the fight is the same. You have the intermission with more of the black sides being covered, so it makes it harder to dodge, but for the rest it's the same. The problem were the numbers, Xy'veza's numbers, in particular the damage taken numbers, the amount of damage you were taking in the fight. Not just in pure HPS, but also by how much things were hurting you and putting you in danger of being one-shot. You know, things like the assassination, the boss ability that spawns the shadows, and then the shadow charging to a player. The assassination was doing 6 million damage, and the charge was doing about 4.5 million damage, which is a lot. It's almost near one-shot territory without using a defensive, which is very, very dangerous. So the nerfs are reasonably big. They're not as big as Broodtwister, not even close, but they do definitely help the problem mentioned, which is the damage of the fight. Because Nexus Princess gets health nerfed by 10% in Mythic difficulty. This is closer to a 5% nerf. Why? Because if we go back to the kills of Nexus Princess, actually to better paint the picture of these 9 guilds, it's better to go over to Warcraft logs. Now, these are the top 9 guilds, I believe, who killed Xy'veza, right? Now, you can see here that they have 1 tank. The 9th guild instant dollars have 1 tank, right? And then Fatshark Yes, 1 tank, Endmyth, 1 tank, Zbox, 1 tank, Jitian Hong, 1 tank, this, 1 tank, Method, 1 tank, Echo, 1 tank, Liquid, 1 tank. Also funny, almost all of them the same comps basically for most of the group, but the one thing was 1 tank. That's how much damage was required in the fight. They realized, hold on a second, with the debuff, the tank debuff they put on the tank, if you bring in a Resto Shaman with Ancestral Protection Totem, which gives you a free combat rest, you can practically drop the debuff, the tank debuff that you need to tank swap for by using the Ancestral Protection Totem, which allows you to 1 tank and allows you to squeeze 1 more DPS, because you needed to break the DPS check mark, but you couldn't do like Broodtwister. Broodtwister you could sort of get by cutting off a healer, because who cares about healing on that fight, it's all about the mechanics and whatnot. You can do it on this fight. You cannot 3 heal Nexus Princess, so you had to 1 tank. Now, this nerf, as I mentioned, is not as big because with this nerf, Chasmal Gash, which is the tank buster, now persists through death. Same change given to Silken Court to stop the tanks, 1 tank in Silken Court. This means that now, even though she has the health nerf by 10%, you also have to now bring out a DPS to bring in a tank again. So you are losing about 5% DPS from losing a DPS, and then the boss's HP is nerfed by 10. So the total offset is nerfed by 10%, buffed by 5% because you lose a DPS, so the total of this would be about a 5% HP nerf, basically. But a few of these other nerfs are also quite helpful, not massive. The biggest one in terms of damage taken in the fight and the ones that will help the healers the most are the Starless Night, which is the first 2 phases of the intermission, and then Eternal Night, which is the last phase intermission, have their ticking damage every second reduced by 15%. This is very good for all of the healers. You have Queen's Bane damage nerfed by 17%, and its time expires 25% faster. This is good for spot healers, you know, the paladin, the priest, who had to deal with this dot. And then you have the one-shot help. This is not much about the healers. Healers couldn't do much about these two besides trying to keep you topped before it came, but if you were getting one-shot by yourself, then it wasn't a healer problem. Assassination damage reduced by 20% and Twilight Massacre reduced by 15%. So the initial spawning of the shadows and then the shadows charging have their damage reduced. So now basically the 6 million damage of assassination is going down to a 4.8 million damage, and then the 4.5 million damage of Twilight Massacre is going down to 3.7 million damage. That's the nerf given to Nexus Princess. So it is a slightly smaller nerf than Broodtwister, but also there is the thing that on Nexus Princess it was much more about gear, right? Broodtwister, it was all about mechanics, so it was harder to deal with it even as you become stronger. For Nexus Princess, because it's easier, much more easier the stronger you become, you know, a new reset, a new, crafted item, a new piece from the vault. Then we also have the catch-up weekly stacking damage and healing buff we will start to get from the next reset that will make you stronger and stronger. So this boss is bound to become easier over time, more so than Broodtwister. That's also why perhaps the nerfs are not nearly as large as Broodtwister. Now, we don't just have raid nerfs, though, we also have Mythic Plus nerfs, because last time that we left each other with were nerfs to Grim Batol and to Siege of Boralus, right? Those were the two dungeons nerfed last reset. However, if we go over to any of the aggregator sites picking up stats from the keys, Grim Batol is still here. It was nerfed and is still the worst dungeon. So Blizzard, probably checking out these stats, goes again and nerfs Grim Batol again. So Draga Shadowburner, first boss, has nothing really. Movement speed of the winds to dodge is reduced by 15%, and the movement speed reduction to players inside the area is reduced by 10%. This is not really anything. Bigger changes, tanks will be really happy for this, are the mutated hatchlings melee damage reduced by 66%, and they can no longer crit. I'm sure you all saw this. You also a tank starting to run down the stairs before the last boss, seeing these small little guys, expecting them to do absolutely nothing and die in 3 hits. Because they just hit like a truck and there is like 8 of them, so the tank gets destroyed. Now, the tank will not get destroyed by these adds anymore. Valiona, so the dragon boss, gets its HP reduced by 13%. Erudax now only targets 2 players with its corruption instead of 3. Twilight Lavabender, the Scourge of Pugs, this trash mob with its pulsing AoE damage, has its pulsing AoE damage nerfed by 25%. These are all the nerfs, good, significant nerfs given to Grim Batol. The other changes are less relevant. Most of the Siege of Boralus stuff really is just fixes, especially this very funny fix. I'm sure, again, all of you might have seen a couple of times, adjusting the timings of Iron Hook and Azerite Charge. Since these two funny guys on pool used to have the same CDs for both, so you will get the Azerite Charge and then the other guy would pull you in, so you will get charged in the middle of all the other members of the party and risk wiping everyone. Now they're getting desynced, so that's also good. Stonevolt gets some decent changes, like the Rock Smasher casting Smash Rock, so the super annoying knockback less frequently, and then Turn Speaker again, spamming the silence, censoring gear less frequently. But definitely the major changes again go to Grim Batol. So after last week's nerfs not really doing much to moving Grim Batol away from the worst dungeon of the season, we will see this week, after another round of nerfs, where will Grim Batol end up in. The last of the change are the changes to the trinkets, because we have buffs given to a bunch of trinkets. Now, it's not that exciting because most of these trinkets to be buffed had to be garbage, right? So that's what they are. Most of these are terrible. There is, however, a couple of standouts. A couple of standouts being the Mercurial Egg and the Spellforge. Because Mercurial Egg is not bad. The Mercurial Egg is the one where you get stacks of primary stat when you stand still, and then gain stacks of secondary stat when you move. You have to balance these two going on and off depending on when you're moving and when you're standing still, and then you have a 2-minute cooldown where you can suspend the eggs stacks for 20 seconds and save them like that, even if you're moving or even if you're standing still. It's not bad, you know. There are many specs that have this egg in the top 5 or the vicinity of the top 5. So getting buffed by 5% would, for example, make this egg go above Void Reaper's Contract and become the 3rd best trinket, for example. The other one, the Spellforge, is not nearly as high rated with most of the other specs. You know, it can get reasonably high, but not as much as the Mercurial Egg. Meanwhile, the other trinkets are just proper garbage. They are all, you know, towards the bottom, like unsalvageable. Even if they get buffed by like 20%, doesn't really matter. Their damage is too low. That's the change given to the trinkets. The last, very last of the changes is a quality of life change given to your profession making. And this one is the fact that now we have the technology to allow you to use your warband stash of materials for your orders, your crafting orders, even your patron orders. Now you can store, let's say you have 4 different characters with a bunch of different professions, many of which are needing herbs or mining ores, for example. Now you can all store these in the warband, and you will be able to still craft all that stuff for your orders. That's the QOL change given to professions. The other one, which we mentioned might have helped with your gold expenditure in the expansion, although it's quite a, you know, let's say Blizzard sized, is the fact that delves now containing the heavy trunks, the treasures around the delves, they have a chance to grant you 1 to 2 reagents instead of 1. And then heavy trunks in tier 7 delves can give you 1 to 3 reagents instead of 1, and delves in 8 plus delves can give you 2 to 3 reagents instead of 1. You know, major improvements to your yield of materials and reagents if you go and like to do a lot of delves. But that was the last of the changes for this incoming reset. Of course, the spotlight was taken by the nerfs given to the raid bosses, followed by the one given to the dungeons, in particular to Grim Batol. But for today, on this Tuesday, on the eve of another reset for the week, we can now leave each other again. We're starting as usual the goodbyes by thanking everyone who has watched this video, together with who is supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. With these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I like it. I like it when it's cloudy like this. You know, it's like cold, no sun, no sunlight, but still no rain, right? So it's a good position to be in.